Hi everyone, checking in with our weekly video here, and we are now to week 3, which, as a reminder within the course, you will be continuing to read through your sources, gathering additional sources as you are going to continue to work on that review of literature. And this week specifically, by the end of the week, what I'm interested in from you is your draft of an outline, rough outline of what you're starting to think about for the different sections for your review of literature. And as you'll hear me talk about today, it's okay if these change as you're continuing to read and you're continuing to learn more. But I'm interested to see where you are now and really what sections you are pretty sure you're going to include, what sections you might include, what sections you realize you have you need more literature on, and so forth. So this is a chance for you to kind of step back from the research and the reading that you're doing and start to think about what those overall sections and themes are that are going to be emerging, and what are those sections that are going to need to be included within the review of literature. So I talked quite a bit last week. You had a couple of videos about the review of literature in general, and so I'm not going to spend as much time, thinking about the review of literature, but more on kind of this process of starting to create an outline that you'll then continue to work on and add to and revise and so on and so forth. But it'll put us on the same page in terms of I can see what you're thinking for your sections of your review of literature. And so something that I did that I think will be helpful in this process is kind of some of my own thinking on creating your outline. And so what I've done here is I've included some questions that I would encourage you to consider as you are thinking about your outline. And there are going to be some sections that are going to be really immediate and really obvious. For example, if I'm talking about service learning projects, I'm going to have an entire section, even just defining, what is included and what is not included in a service learning project, kind of what it is and what it isn't. But then there will be other more nuanced sections that I'll have to make a decision about whether or not they're relevant and pertinent to my research. So overall, some questions to ask yourself is, what kind of background information do I need to provide readers? So I had mentioned to you last time, if I'm in education, you can think about an audience as teachers, but teachers who may not be informed on the specific topic that you are discussing. So that can be kind of hard to tell. One recommendation for you to help guide you is look at the articles that you're reading and see what assumptions they are making, and that will help you to know what your audience does and doesn't know, and that's something I'm more than happy to talk to you about as well. So what kind of background information do I need? So that may be things like defining whatever it is that you're looking at. That might be historical information that you are going to be looking at. But any kind of background information that you're going to need to provide readers on the topic. So another question to keep in mind is, what themes are emerging from your sources? So, this whole thing, I talked about this a little bit last week in terms of a recursive process, but the tricky thing is you don't just read all your sources and then write your review of literature. As you are starting to write your review of literature and make decisions about the content of the review of literature, you are still engaging with your sources and then probably still realizing, oh, I need to add another section here, or oh, maybe I don't need to include a section there. So you are going to continue to be reading and taking notes, but you can't write a review of literature. You can't even write an outline of a review of literature without being deeply immersed in the literature itself. So, if this were me and I'm working on this, I would start to brainstorm some overall topics. So some of the the major, topics or content that I know I'm going to need to include. So going back to this theme of service learning, I know I'm going to need to define what that is, provide background information, but I'm going to have to provide information on some of the pros, the cons, the limitations, the various contexts in which service learning projects have been conducted. So those are things I just know off the top of my head I'm going to have to include. And then beyond that, though, you are going to need to rely pretty heavily on your sources to be able to determine what else do you need to include. So again, as you're reading through other dissertations on your topic, as you're reading through other studies and articles, I would start kind of an ongoing document, which you're welcome to include in here for me to look at, but questions that you have about whether or not you're going to need a section on a specific topic. So for example, when I was doing research on service learning, I found service learning at the college level, which was my context, but within programs that were not teacher education. And so I had a question of, do I include a section on service learning research with college students who were not my primary demographic? And so what I ended up settling on that is if there were studies that did inform what I wanted to do for my study, then I would still include it. So for example, some of those were within business programs. Although when I was looking at service learning projects with college students in business programs, there were some things that were still really useful and helpful that I did end up kind of picking up and applying to my own project. And so I included it. Another way you could do so is if I found service learning projects, which I did in business programs, nursing programs, social work programs, other university programs that were not teacher education, I would not prioritize those, but I would still include them. So I may say, in looking at other studies on service learning in the college context, but not within teacher education, several themes also emerged. And so I was able to take a larger, broader amount of research that was related and still useful, but obviously that was not my specific context for my study. And so I tried to talk about that in a way in terms of what I learned, but that was not a primary section. Of course, the majority of my research and studies were ones that took place within teacher education programs. Another kind of guiding factor there is, if I found something that was unique from what I was finding. So if I found something within a nursing program and I thought, wow, this is really profound, this is really interesting, I'm not seeing anything on this in teacher education, then I thought that was something that was noteworthy. Whereas studies that I read in other programs that I thought, okay, this is similar to what I've already found within teacher education programs, it's not really necessary to cite all of those studies as well. So for each of your topics, overall, just to recommend, things that you're going to need it to include in your review of literature, and then you could start kind of a running list of other topics, other sources that you might include, but you're still making a decision about that. Another good question for you to consider is if there are gaps in your current research. So that too, as you're looking through your sources, and you may realize something may come up as you're looking through those articles, and you might think, oh, I don't even know if I have information on that, then that's other information to include. So for example, in my own experience, some of the feedback that I got from my reviewers, sorry, they're doing work outside of the Burke building and it's really loud, so I hope you can still hear me okay. Of course, that's what happens when you start creating a video. But anyhow, so, one of the things that they said was, okay, this is your theoretical framework, that's great, but have you considered different criticisms of that theory? And so that was something that was a blind spot for me. And then when they mentioned it, I thought, yes, absolutely. I want to make sure to not just talk about the positive aspects of this theoretical framework, but I also want to talk about the criticisms. And so that's something too, as you're looking through your sources, figure out what do you not have any research on that you may need to go out and find moving forward. And that too you could kind of put and list as a question mark, like, am I going to need this eventually for the section? And that is completely fine. Something else that I think will be really helpful and guide you as you are going into this process is thinking about, what is your research question and focus? And this is something that you are going to be continuing to develop throughout this course. You will be turning in a draft of your research questions. But this was always a good guiding factor for me in terms of determining my focus and my scope and what might fall outside of that. Because it can be really interesting, or it can be really common to kind of go down a rabbit hole in an area that's interesting, but it doesn't really directly tie to what you're looking at. So an example of that for me was one thing that I found related to service learning was that service learning in college often results in students being more likely to volunteer in the future. Well, that's really interesting, and there was a lot of research on that, but that wasn't one of the questions that I ended up asking. And so I took my research, and when I talked about the pros, I said this is another cited pro, but I did not belabor that point. I did not include studies that talked about the benefit as students volunteering again in the future. So let me show you an example of what that looks like in terms of the research question. So one of the questions that the broad question that I initially started on was, what are the effects of service learning projects? All right, well, that is really broad, and that would result in a ton of information. And so then I needed to fine tune that a little bit, and I knew I wanted to work with college teacher education students. So I would say, what are the effects as a project within a teacher education program, right? And then I would realize, okay, well, that doesn't really provide very much context. So I might take this same question and now I may say, what are the effects of a semester-long service learning project, right? And that may be a little bit closer, but I still need to provide information. So what is the service learning project going to look like? So what are the effects of a semester-long service learning project where teacher education students work with children at the local YWCA, observing, engaging with, and teaching. Okay, I know this is kind of a mess, but you're following along. So the students are doing this project over a semester. They are doing these following components, and let's add for 10 hours because that was another part of the study. So the other thing is I'm looking here, I'm noticing, well, what are the effects? Well, effects is really general. There could be a ton of effects. And so I started to realize, well, what am I actually looking for? And when I looked at the previous research, as I mentioned, one of the benefits would be that students would volunteer in the future, but I realized that's not what I'm focusing on. So what do I really want to know? And as I thought about it more, I wanted to know the effects on their perception of cultural differences, which I defined, teaching and learning. So how did this affect the way that they would then teach these students? And on literacy in general. So what affects one's literacy, and so on and so forth. So now that I've narrowed it down to these specific aspects, now you'll start to notice that if I'm working on a review of literature, instead of just saying, or in addition, to saying, here's pros, here's cons, limitations, context, now that gives me many more specific details that I'm going to need to include within my review of literature. So now I'm looking for studies with service learning projects related to understandings of cultural difference. I'm now looking at service learning projects that affect students teaching and learning, kind of pedagogy and curriculum decisions. I'm now looking at service learning projects that have to do with literacy and so on and so forth. And so just an example here, we could kind of go on with this forever, but to give you an idea of how you start with your question, how you decide what you know you're going to need to include, good questions that you can ask for what else you might need to include, how looking through your sources will help you to make these decisions, and then how, as you continue to narrow and make decisions about what you specifically might want to do for your project, that those subcategories and specific foci will affect other sections that you would include within your review of literature, and then outlining the sections that you need to include. So hopefully that gave you some added information. I am okay for the draft for these, for them to look really messy, because that's how this whole thing works. It doesn't matter how you format this assignment. I'm interested in the content. I'd be more than happy to talk with you at any point throughout this process in helping you kind of think about what you're going to include for the sections for your review of literature.